Good morning. Can everybody hear me in the back? Before I get started, I'd like to take a moment for everybody that's here. If you haven't done so, let's give a big round of applause for the people that put on this show with the great decorations and everything. Yeah. Awesome. And as you're going through your day, if you would do me a favor, when you see those folks that are doing the service work and putting on the raffles and sitting out at the desk and giving up of their time, stop by and thank them. Let's overwhelm them with love. All right? As JR said, we've got some folks here, and not that I'm competitive or anything, but I looked it up. I'm from Dallas, Texas. And it's 2,800 kilometers, because they're Canucks, I have to do it in kilometers. 2,800 kilometers to get here from Dallas, Texas, and they're 2,900 kilometers. So they really did come the farthest to get here. And I'd like Aaron to come on up here, because what you guys don't realize, come on up, is this week, Aaron gave up some of his time. I think it was Monday, was his 4-year anniversary. All right? Yeah. And as you'll hear in my story, by the way, I'm half girl, so I'll be doing a lot of crying up here, by the way. In my life, I did a stint in the military. I just retired after 24 years, and in my flight suit, I would carry a medallion. So every year, I didn't just get one medallion. My dad would give me a medallion, my brother would give me a medallion, so I'd have several. So I'd have one in my pocket, I always had one in my uniform, I always had one in my flight suit. And this 4-year medallion was my dad's. He gave it to me, and then I carried it. And I want to pass on the legacy of tradition and give it to my really good friend, Aaron. That's the beauty of this program, is you get relationships. I just met this guy 2 days ago for the first time physically. We've been talking for months and months and months over the internet. And if you haven't ever used Skype, I highly recommend it. You can connect with people from all over the world. The last shout out I want to give is to our tapers in the back. I am absolutely indebted to forever to tapers because they've saved my life. With the traveling going back and forth, I would drive a couple hours down to the military base and back, and the itty bitty shitty committee can get in your head and start running. And I would save myself from that by throwing in a CD or a tape. And, so if you haven't had a chance, stop by and see Doug and Bridget in the back. There's wonderful talks back there, and it'll change your life. The stuff that's on those tapes is phenomenal. I can't say enough about it. And another guy that has really been affected is our chairman tonight, JR. What you also don't realize is a couple weeks ago, JR celebrated 17 years. Come on. And I don't usually get a chance to give away the double-digit chips because, unfortunately, a lot of people die. This is a fatal program, This, too, was also my father's 17-year chip, and then it was my 17-year chip, and now it's JR's. Thank you. So now that the crying's over, well, the first set of crying. I'm powerless over alcohol. My name is Dave Fredrickson. And I went to my first Al-Anon meeting in 1978, thanks to my father. Actually, it was not even an Al-Anon meeting, it was an Alateen meeting. So for the Alateens, I don't see them in here, they're probably in their own meeting room. I started in Alateen. Of course, I was still using it at the time, but I loved to get really hammered and go to Alateen. And it was a group that, by the way, do you mind if it's kind of hot up here. It started off with Alateen, and it was a group that had an Alateen, an AA meeting. At the same time, there was an Al-Anon meeting, and an Alateen meeting, and an Alatot meeting. And once a month, they would bring them all together, and we'd have one giant meeting, because it's a family program. So I am what I would classify as a double winner, since I honestly believe in Al-Anon. How many AAs do we have in the room? All right. How many Al-Anons do we have in the room? Every single hand in this room should be raised. If you're in AA, you're in Al-Anon because you love us. And if you're going to sponsor, you need to know the tools that they teach in Al-Anon because your sponsees will, trust me, they'll drive you insane. You need to know the 3 C's. You need to know how to detach with love. You're going to need all those skill sets in order to be an effective sponsor. So I'm putting in a huge plug for Al-Anon, and thank God the Al-Anon's invited AAs here so we can get back together. Because if you don't realize it, for the first 16 years, there was 1 program. There wasn't 2 programs. And before, until 1961 or 2, your literature was our literature. Your literature was the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's written in your traditions. You know, the 5th tradition says you guys work the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Where are you going to find the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous and how to work them? In the Big Book. So I'm putting a plug in for the Big Book. I know officially since 1962 you guys said, well, it's not conference approved. I don't want to get in that fight. But where did you get the 12 steps from? You need to go to the source. All right. So I've been blessed. So I'm standing in front of you as one of the luckiest guys in the world. You know, my kids, a bunch of years ago, they came running into the room, and I have this counter on my computer, which at the time I hadn't even paid attention to. For years I hadn't paid attention to my sobriety and how many days it was. And my kid came running in and he jumped in my lap and he says, Dad, you got 10,000 days today. And I went, wow, 10,000 days. Kind of hit me kind of strong. And I'd forgotten that. I remember the days, you know, when you first get 30 days and then 60 days and then 90 days and you're counting them. And then at some point, you just stop counting. And then you start counting years. Oh, I got another anniversary coming up. And sometimes you even forget about your own anniversary. I was talking to the crane man, to Aaron, on his anniversary. He didn't even know it was an anniversary. He completely forgot about it because he was busy living life, you know, on God's terms. He was so focused on being effective for God, it wasn't like he was hanging a big deal. So for me today, it's 10,738 days. I got sober December 5th, 1981, and I was a teenager when I came into the rooms. There was a whole lot that occurred before then. I was raised in an alcoholic household. As I said, my dad, he's coming up on 34 years. He's got 34. He's coming up on 35 years this year. And I have a brother who lives up in Santa Cruz, and he's coming up on 29 years on Memorial Day. So between the 3 of us, my family has been blessed with 92 years of sobriety, you know. So I believe this deal because I've experienced it from a personal aspect. And growing up as a little kid, you know, there's that hopelessness that you don't understand what's going on when you wake up in an alcoholic household, and all of a sudden you're kind of going, what's the deal here? You know, one minute they love you, and the next minute you feel like you've done something wrong, and you just can't make the connection. What's going on? You know, and I always felt like everybody else in the world had a playbook for how to work life, except me. You know, so I got very good at sitting back and watching everybody else. What's going on? And as soon as I kind of figured out what was going on, then I jump in the middle of it and want the center of attention because I finally got this thing figured out. But inside, I was terrified. Can anybody else identify with that feel of terror inside? And God forbid you make a mistake because then you're going to get found out. Oh, man, I've got clay feet. I'm human. You know, it would devastate me emotionally, you know. And so where do you look to? You look to your parents. And I was looking at my parents, and, you know, they were knee-deep in this disease, watching what was going on. My mom was a phenomenal codependent. You know, every one of her brothers and sisters, I have 8 aunts and uncles on her side. They're all either alcoholic or married alcoholics. You know, so that side is contaminated, and my father's side is contaminated. I'm a contaminated gene pool baby, you know. We come from addiction. We do addiction really well in my family. And my dad, his addiction took off. And I remember from a very young age, you know, standing by the front door, and nothing would be okay until Dad came home. But he didn't come. And Mom would send you to bed, and you'd be lying in bed waiting, you know. And as the disease got worse, Mom wouldn't wait for Dad to come home. The dinner would be in the oven, and it would be overcooked. And Dad would come home, and I was always the little kid that would get up in the middle of the night and go sit down at the kitchen table with Dad while he ate his dinner by himself. And he was always in the bag. And I learned to love that smell of stale booze and cigarettes. Anybody else love that smell? Man, I'm home when I smell that, you know? But that's what I grew, and I realized that there was power in alcohol, because whenever Dad would come home, family would stop. Everybody would be up on the brakes, Dad's home. And Mom we'd all kind of look to Mom because she had radar. The radar would go off and she would kind of make the determination, how is he? Is he in a good mood? Is he in a bad mood? Because if he was in a good mood, we were in a good mood. If he was in a bad mood, she'd send us the signal and we'd all scatter. We'd disappear. And no matter what time Dad would come home, if dinner was at 6 o'clock and if Dad didn't come home till 7, we held the dinner waiting for Dad to come home. And of course, whenever Dad got home, he had to have a cocktail. So that went off in my head. Alcohol has power. Because we all would wait for him to finish his cocktail and then we'd have dinner. And that was early on in the addiction, but as his addiction got worse, then I realized that we wouldn't even stop for that. And then the fighting started and all that. And you guys know how the disease goes. It progresses, it gets ugly. And so that's what I grew up with. And I detached emotionally, but I had that spirit in me. I wanted that power. I wanted that authority because I assumed that would give me control. And that maybe that was the key to the playbook that I was missing, that I didn't understand how life was working, And I desperately wanted to be liked. So as a kid growing up, I would try anything to get people's attention. I was the kid in kindergarten that brought live ammunition to show and tell, Got a lot of attention, the wrong kind of attention. Today that would get you expelled. But that's the kind of kid I was, But I craved the attention. And if I couldn't get attention, I was the kid that would take over the piece of equipment on the playground, And I'd play King of the Mountain, and it was mine. Everybody else wanted to play it. No, that's mine. And so at a very early age, they would send me to the principal's office. Everybody else would go out and play, and Dave would go to the principal's office, and they would have little chores for me to do. I'm old enough, yes, I would run the mimeograph machine. And for you young kids, if you don't know what a mimeograph machine, it was a thing you cranked to make copies, And there was a really neat secretary there, and it was I think she had to have the disease somewhere in her family, because she understood me and she loved me. Every day I'd show up in that office and I was somebody. She'd have a chore for me to do, and she'd look at me and she'd say, honey, how you doing today? Is everything going okay? And she'd give me these little chores, and I found some self-worth doing service work. And it wasn't until I came into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous that I got that same sense of I'm okay when I'm helping somebody else. When I'm working for somebody else, I'm connected to God and I'm okay. But there was a huge gap between those years where I had that hole in the center of my stomach, and I was just trying to fill that hole, that emotional hole that you don't know what goes into it, right? So it was chaos at my house growing up. And then we moved, and my father decided he wanted to buy a gentleman farm. So he bought this gentleman farm, and he was an airline pilot. And so he'd go off on these trips for 3 or 4 days, and then he'd come home, and we had fields of corn and stuff, and pumpkins and garden, vegetables and summer squash and zucchini and that sort of stuff. And as soon as we were old enough, then it was sort of like became our chore, So Dad would come home and he'd get up late because he was hungover, and then he'd kind of sit in his underwear at the front kitchen table and he'd say, hey, go throw rocks in the field, or go plow this, or go do that. And once again, I realized I want to be doing that. I want to have that kind of power. And so I was always jealous, and I knew he had something that I didn't have, and I wanted it, whatever it was. I couldn't put my finger on it. And when he would go out and work the fields, one of the things I learned was, at the end of the day, Dad would always get 2 quarts of Pabst Blue Ribbon. So I would always volunteer. I'll take it out to him, because he'd start on one and I'd get to start on the other. And that magic elixir, that little, the flush of the warmth of your face and that smell, even though I wasn't particularly, as a young kid, I didn't particularly like the taste, I sure identified with the effect. A little bit of that power, and I felt okay for just a short period of time, So it was a large quest, As much as I loved my dad, I hated the man. I hated what he did when he was drinking, but I wanted that power. It was so elusive to me, And we had, there's times, everybody says there's bad times, but there was some good times. He'd throw these parties and stuff, and I'd look and I'd say, wow, I want that. I remember a time when he was 3 sheets to the wind, and he poured gasoline all over his feet, and he climbed up into the 2nd story of the barn, lit his feet on fire, and took a giant umbrella and jumped out, Of course, the umbrella goes whoosh, bang, straight down, boom. He's rolling around on the ground, they're trying to put him out, and I'm thinking, man, I want that. For anybody that sounds like a good idea, guess what? That's not normal, but that's what I wanted, So I saw this dichotomy. I saw that, you could have great time, but then you'd see the fights and the arguments and what's causing this? Once again, I felt like I don't understand what this deal is. I want it, but I don't want it. That's what it's been my entire life is I want this, but I don't want this sometimes. And what causes that? And how do you figure it out? I just couldn't get it, And so it went on, and I don't need to go into all the drunkalog stories, but it was kind of chaos growing up. And then one of the best things in the world happened for my family, but it was one of the worst things for me personally. When I was a freshman in high school, my dad got sober. He came into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, that was just as I was starting to bud. I was starting to drink, and I was doing other things. And, the first time I got arrested for dealing drugs, I was 13, twice when I was 14, twice when I was 15. And the only reason I was doing that stuff was I couldn't get access to alcohol. From a good standpoint, when Dad came in to recovery, his liquor cabinet was then kind of like open season, so I started stealing liquor and filling the bottles up with water and stuff, and my own addiction started to progress. But here's a guy now who knows every trick in the book. He can read me like the back of his hand because he knows he can see what's going on. He knows he's got a kid with a problem, and I couldn't figure this out. I'd go out and I'd come home, and if he was home, he'd be sitting in the back of the house in the kitchen, which is about as far in our house as you can get away from the front door. And you're doing the step. You're trying to walk, and you're stumbling a little bit, and you're trying not to make any noise, and you slide open the front door, and that little creak, and then I'd hear, "David, man, no." And so I'd walk in, and I'd just barely break the plane of the kitchen. And it's a big kitchen. It's a giant great room kitchen. He'd be sitting at the far end of the table, listening to Dixieland Jazz or whatever, reading the newspaper, and he'd look at me, and he'd start this conversation. "So where have you been?" And I called it the interrogation would start. Who were you out with? Where have you been? And then within about 30 seconds, he'd look at me and he'd go, "You've been drinking." I'd be like, "How does this guy know this?" And I'm embarrassed to say that I must have been like 10 or 12, maybe 15 years sober before I figured out he knew that if I'd been out, I'd been drinking. It wasn't brain surgery, but it took me a while to put the connection together, And so my brother and I, my older brother Donnie's 2 years older than I, our addiction started off, and we went out and we had some fun times, We'd get arrested by the cops, and they'd bring us home because my dad used to be a volunteer policeman in town. So they'd be like, "Hey, how's your dad doing?" "Oh, he's doing great." "Oh, I haven't seen him in a while." "Oh, he's doing great." There was this wonderful man, his name was Wandy Cox. He was the truant officer. I'd cut school, I'd hitchhike hitchhike to the train, take the train into Manhattan because we lived in North Jersey. And then I'd take the train back out, and I'd be hitchhiking back to school to catch the late bus. So my parents wouldn't know that I would cut school all day. And along would come Wandy Cox. His shift would be over, and he'd be driving up the highway, and he'd stop by, and he'd pick me up. And he'd be like, "Hey, man, I haven't seen your dad. How you doing?" And I'd be like, "Great." He goes, "Where are you going?" "I'm going back to school, sir." "Well, let me give you a ride." And we'd pull into the parking lot, and he'd say, "Front or back?" And I'd be like, "Back, please." Meaning, drop me off at the back of the school. If you drop me off at the front, we're going in to see the principal, And what he didn't know is I'd be sweating bullets because I'd have a whole bunch of drugs in my pockets and all kinds of other stuff, But he could see I was a kid in trouble. And he knew that throwing a book at me wasn't going to help me. Arresting me wasn't going to get my attention. He befriended me. And I remembered that, and he spoke truth to me. He poured into my life. And I remember to this day, I remember some of the kind things that Wandy Cox told me in that process, So throughout this addiction that I had, there was always these little angels that God would put in my path, would pour some truth into me. And those are little seeds of truth are what sprout into recovery. Once you get sick and tired of being sick and tired and you can't take it anymore, those thoughts cut right through your wall of delusion, and they smack you between the eyes, and you're like, "Wow, I've heard this before. Where did I hear that message? I know exactly what I need to do." It's from people like that. So, I was terrible. D's and F's, cutting school all the time, and I got to the point where I said, everybody's talking about colleges, and I realized if I want to get away from my sober father, I got to get the heck out of town. So, I put a thumbtack in the map and drew a giant circle around, 2,000-mile circle, and said, "Let's look for schools outside of this circle." And my grades, needless to say, were terrible. But overnight, when an alcoholic wants to put their mind to something, they can put their mind to something. And so overnight, I went from D's and F's to A's and B's because I now had a motivation. If I wanted to party, I got to get out of this locale. And I got accepted into a school out in Arizona that if you had enough money, they'd take you. And and you got to remember, up to this point, my father's addiction, and now I'm budding in my addiction. Now he's a threat to me, So at that point, I hated the man. I didn't want anything like him, Yet I still, the little boy inside of me wanted to be just like him, And since he was an airline pilot, I had dreams of becoming an airline pilot. So I went to an aviation university out in Arizona. And he and my mom took me out to Arizona, and I mean, he wasn't even back to the airport to go fly home, and I had already taken the money he'd left into my bank account and put it in my own bank account name, and I was off. That was going to be my stake. That was going to be a grub stake to start my life. And it was like, don't call me, I'll call you. And I was off to the races. And let me back up a little bit. In New Jersey, the drinking age was 18. And it was the strangest things. Almost up until 9/11, they didn't have pictures on their IDs. And I have an older brother, Bob. And from a descriptive standpoint, we're identical. We're the same height, we have the same last name, the same hair color, the same eye color, and I know his birthday. So if I get half in the bag and they card me, I'm not gonna get tripped on the birthday. You know, I even know the address, so it was a perfect ID. So the day my older brother turned 18, I snuck into his room and stole his driver's license out of his wallet. You know, and that was my key, because now I had the ability to get alcohol. And I started drinking like a fish. At that point, I was still periodic. I didn't have the mental obsession all the time. But when I drank, I would get the physical craving, which would cause me to drink until I ran out of money or passed out. But I didn't drink. I wasn't a daily drinker at that point. When I got to college, by the time I finished college, I was a daily drinker. And here's the problem. That frustration of not having that playbook, there was anger and resentment inside of me. You know, and so when I would drink, it would let that out. And I couldn't tell. I was the classic Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We could go out and have an absolute blast, or we could go out and you could be my best friend and you could bump into me and spill my drink and I literally would put you in the hospital. You know, I was a violent drunk, and I became very violent, and I have a taste for bar fights. Is there anybody else in here that likes to bar fight? Oh man, you've got this pain inside of you, and you can unleash that pain, at least for a short period, until you sober up. And then the guilt and the shame and the remorse of what you did, it is unbelievably overwhelming when it comes pouring in. And we have a fix for that. You got to put our alcohol on it to put out the flames. You know, so it was this perpetual, as they say, you know, it's the merry-go-round, right? And it took a while for me to get to the point where I stopped the merry-go-round and want to get off. I was just in that routine, and I didn't care what kind of devastation was in my wake. It was all about getting my next drink. And it got really ugly. And the violence caught up to me. You know, my last night of drinking, I don't remember it. I know that I started the night to party, and it was a Friday night, and nobody really wanted to party with me. And, you know, let me back up. My father had come out, and it's a weird thing. I have a twin sister, right? And my twin sister and we were born on my father's birthday. So we have a triple header. I mean, I don't know what the statistical odds of that is, but it's pretty rare. And it was my birthday, October 19th. And my mom and dad had flown out to Arizona to have birthday dinner with me. You know, and I said, hey guys, thanks for coming up. I didn't invite you. You know, my friends are going to take me out. We're going to go out partying, you know. And so I wished them well, and they went off to dinner by themselves. I didn't even go to my birthday dinner with my father and my mother. I went out, and there was really only one really nice restaurant in town. So I'm sitting up at the bar drinking, and it's open view to the rest of the restaurant, and my mother and father are sitting in the restaurant watching me get drunk on my birthday. That started from October 19th to December 5th, 1981. I did not draw a sober breath. The emotional pain was excruciating. If you've ever lived anything like that, you know what I'm talking about. It is unbelievably vicious. And the depths you can sink to in that state, because you're desperate, you're fighting for your life, and you don't know how to win. There is no winning. You can't beat that in single-handed combat. But I was going to give it a shot. So I go out to party. My last night, I shot a bottle of 151 because my friends didn't want to party with me. They kind of stepped back. You know, so I finished this bottle of 151 rum, and then one of my other roommates made a comment, and so I beat him up. And then the other two roommates tried to take me on, and so I beat them up. And the fourth roommate had a job, so he was off at this job, and the story has been told to me. I don't really know the whole story, but basically he tapped me on the shoulder, and as I turned around, he cold-cocked me, and I went down a set of stairs, and I landed on my face on concrete. And then, of course, with my background, when they called the cops, you know, because I'm bleeding all over the place. And when the police show up, what does a good drug dealer do? He runs. So I took off and ran out into the desert. And I had been dating a girl who happened to be an EMT. And just so happens, that night, she was on duty, you know. And so she told me the story. She said, you know, I'm driving out from town. We got this call to go out to the college. We didn't know why. And I'm driving down the road, and there in the high beams, it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, there's this bloody body walking out, stumbling out of the desert. See, I'd run into a barbed wire fence, and it kind of sliced me up a little bit. And She said, all I had to do was open up the back of the ambulance and pull out the gurney. He said, you just walked up and laid down. God had my attention, right? So, this man that I had hated, I had detested up to that point, he had bothered to show service. It was my first example of service in Alcoholics Anonymous, because he'd flown 2,000 miles. It may have even been on the birthday trip, I don't know. He's in the back of the room, you can ask him. But the moment that I came to out of the coma in intensive care, they said, can we call somebody? And the first thought that crossed my mind is, yeah, call my parents. And my dad had flown out, and he'd talked to the guys in AA and said, listen, I'm either going to need guys to 12-step my son, or I'm going to need pallbearers, one or the other, And within about 2 hours, there were people in intensive care in my hospital room from AA. And they patched me up enough to get me down to Sky Harbor Airport, put me on an airplane to fly home. And as far as I know, I'm the only person that I know that has come to Alcoholics Anonymous that can say this, because my face had been so crushed from that impact that you could touch my nose, it would kind of like slide across my face, and that crunching sound, I'll never forget that crunching sound. So the way they fixed it is they took pictures of me, of what I used to look like, and they matched it, and they stuffed strips of cotton or something up my nose until it kind of made me look where I was, and then they cast my entire head. So when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, all you knew was my name was Dave and I had blue eyes, because my whole head was in a cast. I was completely anonymous, And there was a sense of freedom in that, because I could come into the rooms and nobody really knew me, But a lot of the people had already known me, because if you wanted to see my dad up to that point, before I'd gone to college, basically the man went to work and he went to AA meetings. That was it. If you wanted to see him, you had to go with him to a meeting. So he'd get home late from a trip. He'd get up the next morning. He'd be sitting in his underwear at the kitchen table. That was typically his routine. Then all of a sudden he'd look at his watch and go, oh, time for the noon meeting. He'd run upstairs, and he'd come running back downstairs and say, you want to go with me? And one of my favorite deals in the whole world was to get absolutely hammered and go to AA meetings, because you were my people, right? You're the same people I would have in the bar. So I'd be like, yeah, Dad, I'll go with you. So I would go to meetings. So I had been exposed, and I knew I was an alcoholic. I just wanted the 35 or 40 years of drinking that my dad had before I'd come in, I wanted to push this deal and come right up to the precipice, to the edge of the cliff, lean over, and then take one step back and say, okay, I'm ready to go to AA. I thought I had that kind of control, the insanity of it. Well, I almost went all the way off, but God's grace brought me back. So now I start into meetings, and I'm a teenager. What do I know? I'm unemployable. I'm a college dropout. My brother had come into the rooms maybe a month before me, so we started palling around, going to AA meetings, and we'd steal money out of my mom's purse, whatever, and we'd go to meetings, and after the lunchtime meeting, and back then we had eaten meetings for lunch. You'd go to a noon meeting, and they would put out a little spread. They'd have sandwich meats or whatever. And so I'd get fed at the noontime AA meeting, and then we'd go off to an arcade. We'd have a couple quarters, and we'd sit there and we'd play arcade games, and then until the evening time, and then we'd go to an evening meeting, then we'd go home and have dinner, and we'd go back to another meeting at night. That was the routine. All I did was go to meetings. And at a certain point, I had to do something with my life, and this guy came walking up to me and he said, hey, you got a job? I said, no. And he looked at my brother, he goes, you got a job? And he said, no. And Carl said, well, you do now. He says, I'll be at your house at 6 o'clock in the morning. I know where you live, so be ready to go. Wear some boots and have a set of leather gloves, and we'll go to work. And Carl was a Mason, and everybody on his crew was in recovery. And he could see that we were just these two guys that were lost, these two young kids, And so he gave us a job. And so he'd pick me up at 6 o'clock in the morning, we'd go off to the job, and everybody on the crew's in recovery. And so it was like an AA meeting all day long, So he had me mixing mud, cement, So I would be shoveling in the cement, and my brother would be buggy lugging the cinder blocks, and, you'd drop a big cinder block on your foot, and you'd be hopping around, and they'd be throwing cliches at you, Easy does it, this too shall pass, you just... We were like their play toys, And if you're a sponsor, you'll know what that's about. They would just egg us on to see how far that we could go. And then at lunch, we'd have a meeting. We'd all sit around in the shade of a tree or whatever, and we were doing masonry, and we also did some roofs and other kinds of construction. And it was AA, and it was my first entrance into real spiritual fellowship of AA, was working with Carl and his crew. And then he'd bring me home at night, because that's what he did. And he'd say, I'll take a shower, eat something, and I'll be back in an hour and a half. We're going to a meeting. And that's what we did. Back then, you didn't go to meetings by yourself. You went in gangs. There was like packs. We called it, today they'd call it a posse. You'd have 2 or 3 guys. We'd get together and we'd go to a meeting. And then if there was somebody in your home group that was speaking, had a speaking commitment, half the speaking commitment group would go to the speaking commitment. You'd show up in a mob, you know, you'd kind of take over somebody else's home group, and one or two or three members of your group would share. You'd have a leader and a speaker and a secretary that would share that meeting as a guest from another group. And there was a meeting on the way to the meeting, and there was a meeting, and then there was a meeting on the way home from the meeting. I mean, you were just immersed in the stuff. And we would be talking about all the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous and Al-Anon. It was wonderful stuff. And I'll never forget, how much time do I have? We don't know. We're going to wing it. Just wave at me when we're out of tape. So you guys are in for the long haul, sorry. So we're driving down the road, and there's this place in New Jersey. It's very beautiful. If you get away from the city, it's spectacular. You know, we had black bear and you know, red fox and stuff. It's country. And it was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and it was in the fall or early spring, you know, and it was one of those mornings where the sunshine is just coming up. And there's a little place called the Black River, and it was one of those mornings where it was so cold, the water was warmer than the air, and so you had this mist that was kind of flowing up over the river. And Carl cranks down the window in this beat-up old masonry dump truck. And I'm like, Carl, shut the window. It's freezing. What are you doing? He's doing this. He's waving out the window. And I'm like, Carl, what are you doing? He says, I'm waving to God. And that was a turning point in my life. Because now all of a sudden, here's a guy that I trust. You know, I believe everything this guy is teaching me, and he's talking about God. Well, I hadn't been raised with God. I didn't, you know, when I was a little kid in the middle of the addiction of my father, my mother one day, she came to me and she said, you know, if you want to go to Sunday school, I'll take you. Otherwise, you can stay home and play. Sunday school, play, you know, I'll let you figure out which one I chose. So I really didn't have any experience with God. And here's a guy I trust, waving. And that sat with me for a couple days, you know. And now, meanwhile, my brother Don and I, we're best buds, and we're hanging out in meetings, and we're 13-stepping all over the place as much as we can get away with. And, you know, I'll never forget it. It was on a weekend, and we'd gone to a meeting, and since it was a weekend, we didn't have any work with Carl, so we're walking out by the barn, and I looked at him and I said, you don't really believe in this God shit, do you? And he stopped, and he squared off to me. I'll never forget this. He looked me straight in the eye, and he says, oh yeah, I believe in God. And you could have pushed me over with a feather. Here's another guy that I trust with my life who's telling me he believes in God. Now, up to that point, if you had mentioned God more than 2 or 3 times in an AA meeting, I'd get up and leave. I'd go outside and I'd start smoking cigarettes. I'd eat some Twix candy bars, drink a Coke or whatever, and then I'd come back in the meeting with a resentment. You know, I can't believe they're talking about God. Oh, how could they do that to me? You know, it planted a seed. Now, as you could tell when I started the talk, there's no competition in me. I wouldn't compare the distance I came to the guys from Canada. But my brother looks at me and he says to me, I'm getting ready to do my 5th step. And I went, excuse me? He says, yeah, I'm getting ready to do my 5th step. Now, up to this point, the steps were kind of theoretical. Carl would teach us about it, and he'd talk about it, and he'd talk about it in the big book, and I was kind of sucking it up through osmosis. And once again, remember the playbook. I don't understand what's going on, so I'm going to kind of sit back. And I hadn't officially, formally asked Carl to be my sponsor yet, but I'm kind of getting this information. I want to know the whole deal before I commit, right? But here's my brother, and there's no way my brother's going to beat me to a 5th step. Are you kidding me? Not going to happen. So I got to get some more information. Well, who are you doing your 5th step with? Oh, I'm doing it with Leo. And I go, Leo, the old guy from Chester? He goes, oh, yeah. All right. So Leo's the nicest guy. You know, he's this little frail man. You know, at that time, he was probably in his 60s. You know, to me, that was, as a teenager, that was old, you know. And so I went up to Leo real quick and I said, hey, Leo, you got any time this week? You know, because my brother told me when his 5th step was going to be. And so I said, before whatever the date was, you know, before the 23rd. And he's like, sure, I do. What do you want? I said, well, can I come over and talk with you? I want to do a 5th step with you. He says, okay, sure. And I said, well, where do you live? And he tells me he lives next to the church in town. I'm like, perfect. I know exactly where that church is. I can meet you there. I show up and he opens up the door and he's standing there and he's got a collar on. And I'm like, I'm a little slow on the uptake, as I told you already. And I looked at him and I said, Leo, you going to a costume party? What's the deal? I had absolutely no idea that Leo was a Catholic priest. Now, you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in God and who's not Catholic, and somebody who hasn't done any step work, you know, and God bless Leo, you know. If there's a way to do the steps wrong in this program, I've done it, you know. So Leo invites me in, and I thought, you know, he's the coolest guy in the entire world because he hands me an ashtray. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm in a priest's house, and he's going to let me smoke. And so I did the only thing I knew what to do. What I'd heard in meetings was I told him my life story. And God bless him, he sat there and listened to this garbage that, half of it wasn't true. And so finally Leo looks at me and goes, that's a good start, but why don't you go talk to Carl and get some more information, then we'll come back and we'll do the next level, because there's more pieces to this than what we just did here. And I said, got it, ready to do that. So I'm scared of Carl, and I still don't know the whole story from my playbook yet. So I said to Carl, would you sponsor me? And he said, sure. And so he starts me through the steps, but I then go to Leo, and I said, Leo, I'm ready to do the next step, right? He's like, great, have you written something? Oh, yeah. I hadn't written anything, So the next time I'm supposed to see Leo, I get to the parking lot about a half an hour early, and I had an envelope there, and I flipped the envelope up, and I wrote some things on the back of the envelope. That was my fourth step on the back of an envelope. I didn't do the big book fourth step as it's outlined in the book. It was probably my third or fourth, at least, inventory into this deal. So my message is you can't do this thing wrong unless you don't do it. That's the only way to do this thing wrong. The steps are there. Find somebody and give it a shot. It's sort of like that old expression. The only dumb question is the question that doesn't get asked. Well, the only wrong way to do the steps is not to do them. Other than that, give it a shot. But there's so many people that can show you how to work the 12 steps. Well, Carl was great. He took me through the 12 steps. He showed me it was in the big book. Gave me one of the greatest gifts of my life, was he showed me the nuts and bolts of how to work with the book. But I started to notice something was going on with Carl. Now, I'm digging ditches during the day, and I'm working construction, and I'm going to county college at night, which was very much a humbling experience, because, I'm the big I am, right? I'm going to county college, come on. But I was happy to do it. And Carl kept mentioning things to me like, you're a smart kid. You need to do something with your life. You need to find a better job. You need to go someplace. You need to grow, And at the same time, he was getting upset, because Carl I think he was one generation away from Bill Wilson. He had been given the message almost pure from the co-founders down. There was a lot of old timers in our area, because it's North Jersey, and Bill Wilson spent a lot of time in North Jersey. And so these guys had the original message, which was all about God, and it was connection to the Oxford group, and it was working out of the 12 steps out of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was one of those things where everybody had nicknames. There was Big Ears Danny and Cincinnati Patty and Come On Now George. George was this little Polish guy, and he would almost seem like he wanted to box all the time. And when he'd share, he'd be in the middle of his share, and all of a sudden he'd pound on the table and go, "Come on now, people!" And he was going to make a point. And so we nicknamed him Come On Now George. And everybody had these nicknames. And Carl would talk about these guys reverently. And he'd say, I miss the old timers, because they were starting to die off. The original people that had carried him the message. And he's like, I don't like what's going on in AA. And I'd say, what do you mean? And he'd say, well, it's becoming a dumping ground. Everybody's talking about their problem. And there's all this rehab crap. And today I can look back on it and see that Carl was getting a resentment. And AA was changing right in front of him, and he didn't like what he was seeing, So at one point, I was still working for him, and I called him up and said, we got any job? What are we doing Monday? And he says, I don't know. I haven't got anything firm yet. I'll give you a call. Monday came and went, no Carl. Tuesday came and went, no Carl. I'm calling him. He's not returning my calls. Maybe 4 or 5 days later, I don't even remember how long it was, I finally get a return call from Carl, and I said, what's going on? And he says, well, I moved. He just packed up his entire house, and he moved up into the woods in North Jersey, and he stopped going to meetings. He just said, I don't want to be part of what I see in the rooms today. It's not what I got sober with. They're not talking about God. They're just dumping their problems. It's like a recovery group. It's like a group therapy, and that's not what it's about. And Carl taught me that you bleed on the tables. If you do something wrong, if you don't practice these principles, you bring it to your group and you share about it, yes, but you also share about what the solution is. So because I made this mistake, I wrote this inventory, I shared it with my sponsor, I made the amend, and you report to the group how you solved the problem. You don't, it's page 17 in our book, half common problem, half common solution. You don't just dump the problem, you also share the solution and you use it as an experience. And he wasn't hearing that. And so the man that gave me the gift, he disappeared. He was around long enough to give me the gift, and for that I'm tremendously grateful. And my life took off. Great things started happening. Now you got to remember, I'm a drug addict and a drunk, and I still wanted to be a pilot, and I'd started to learn how to fly out in Arizona. I'd given up that dream, So when I graduated from college, I had enough flight time, and I applied to the military. And I'm thinking, there's no way the military is ever going to give me a job, because of my past. What I didn't know is if you tell them the truth, miracles will happen. So I told them the truth, and the little known regulation that I didn't realize, that if you'd had a number of years clean and sober, they wouldn't hold it against you. So I told them the truth, and I'm thinking, they're never going to give me a security clearance. And the next thing you know, they did. And they sent me to pilot training, and I'm flying airplanes. And it was just an absolute neat period of my life. And at college, I'm walking across the parking lot. You know, I'm a big cheese on campus because I'm an older kid now. I'm at college. I knew every kid. I mean, it was maybe 3,000 people total in this college. It was a small college in Pennsylvania. I knew every single girl on campus. Without a doubt, I knew them all. And I look up and I see these two girls walking towards me, and I'm thinking, wow, fresh meat. You know? And I'm going, wow, that one woman, she's beautiful. And I was struck in love right on the spot. And I go upstairs and I put my box down. I was loading, coming back from summer break. I looked at my roommate Fritz and I said, I just saw the woman I'm going to marry. You know? And that's how alcoholics do it. I hadn't even met the woman. I'm already going to marry her, you know? That's just the way we roll. So Carl had taught me the steps quite well. And so when I did an inventory, there's 5 pieces to a 4-step out of the big book. You have a resentment inventory, you have a fear inventory, you have a harms done to others inventory, you have a sex inventory, and then you write a sex ideal from the inventory. It gives you how your behavior is supposed to be in the future. Now, I had this ideal, but I really wasn't comparing it because all I was looking at was the outside. And I see this woman, and I'm going, I want to meet this girl. And I meet her later that night, and I'd known the girl for, I don't know, an hour and a half, and we're walking across campus, and I sat her down on a set of steps, and I did something I'd never done before. I said, you know, I really like you, but you need to know who I am, where I come from. And I told her my story. I'm thinking she's going to run away screaming for the hills. You know, hopefully today she'd be smart enough to run away screaming for the hills knowing my story. But she didn't. She's like, wow, her dad was a pilot, my dad was a pilot. There was drinking in her family, there was drinking in my family. So imagine how we attract these people that have the disease. It's amazing to me, you know. And she started asking me about recovery, and I took her to a couple Al-Anon meetings and left her on her own and said, if you want to go, go, you know. And thank God she took it to Al-Anon. It was amazing to watch her, you know. And so today I'm married to a woman who's a black belt Al-Anon. She's sitting in here too, and she keeps me in line. But it was a scary thing for me because I still didn't have a playbook, you know, and my only person that I can talk to now, because Carl's gone, is I've got Leo as my sponsor, and so she and I would drive back and we'd talk with Leo. Now I'm talking to a Catholic priest about how to have a relationship, you know. My only other resource is the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and let me tell you, if you go to AA to try to learn how to have a relationship, you're going to an empty well. We can tell you how to get divorced, we can tell you how to cheat on our spouse, we can tell you all kinds of things. But there's very few people that can tell you how to have a healthy relationship, you know. Where did I learn how the skills to have a relationship? From Al-Anon and Leo. Unusual combination, but I learned some of the skills of how to detach with love and how to show some vulnerability, intimacy, into me see. And we're going to be talking about that on Sunday. If you're in here, we're going to be talking about transparency, and I'll be going into more in detail about that. But I learned from you folks, you know, and so we got married, and I'm in the military, and I got hired with the airlines, and I mean, life couldn't get any better. But the problem is, I went from all these meetings and doing step work and carrying the message to now my life is filling up with this really good stuff. So when you need some conflict resolution, when you need to drop something, what do you drop? Well, I don't need to go to that meeting. You know, next thing you know, I haven't been to a meeting in a week, and then it has been to a meeting in a month, and then it's, you know, and I'm getting very, 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 very dry. And I'm married, and she's complaining, and I'm thinking, what are you complaining for? I'm bringing home a paycheck, you know, and I'll never forget it. She would go to work, and I'd be on my day off because I'm flying airplanes for a living. So if I'm gone for 3 or 4 days, and when I come home, my time's my own. So she'd get up to go to work, and I'd be sitting in my underwear playing video games on the computer. She'd come home from work, I'd be sitting in my underwear playing video games. And, you know, and the unreasonableness of her, she would complain about that and say, I'm off working and you're not doing anything. And my only response was, well, I bring home a paycheck. What are you complaining about? You know? And then she laid down the law. And only Al-Anons know how to do this. And I tell you, I thought she was extremely unreasonable when she looked at me and she said, you know, I'm married to you and I love you and I want to spend time with you. And I forget whether she said 30 minutes or an hour a day, but, you know, I thought, you bitch. You want to spend that much time? And I called. Now, when I had moved away, I wasn't using Leo as a sponsor. When I came back, I'd gotten a different sponsor because Leo was getting old and he was a snowbird. He spent half his time in Florida. So I got a local sponsor, And he was a young guy, he was in his 40s, and he was working on the treadmill, and he had dropped dead, you know? So I had gone for a period of about 4 years, 3 or 4 years, sponsorless. And then I started that great codependency, sick behavior of co-sponsoring with another friend of mine whose name was also Dave. So Dave and I were kind of sponsoring each other. And what that means is we co-sign each other's BS, you know? And I called up Dave, and I'm complaining to Dave, and I'm saying, you know, I can't believe what she wants. She wants, let's say it's an hour of my time a day, and as it's coming out of my mouth, I hear it, and I'm thinking, you sick SOB. Here's somebody that you love, and she wants to spend time with you, and she's trying to tell you that, and you're taking it as an affront to your personal time so that you can, what, play Falcon on the computer? Are you kidding me? But that's how sick I got to, you know? And that was a seed that really started to germinate because I went back into that pain place, and I got really sick. Now, here I am with double-digit sobriety, and I'm not doing the deal. I'm not doing anything on the deal. The guys that I'm sponsoring, you know, I wouldn't just sponsor anybody that would come through the door. I'd kind of look at them and go, how hard are they going to be? You know, the homeless guy, forget it. He's too much time. I'd look for somebody that hadn't really gone too far down, and then I'd hand them a 12 by 12 and say, here, you can find step one, because it would take less time. I just said, go read step one and we'll talk about it. I wasn't given the gift that I had been given. I wasn't taking guys through the big book, because that's a commitment of time. And I didn't have time. It was all about me. And my ego had rebuilt. If you haven't read anything about the alcoholic ego rebuilding, go read Harry Tebow out of AA Comes of Age. Great essays in the back. If you're an alcoholic, it'll save your life as your ego rebuilds. And my ego had rebuilt, and I was dry as a fire hazard. It was scary. And I got really depressed, and I hated my life. I didn't like what I was doing. And one day I was home cleaning my 9mm, and anybody that's military trained, you clear the weapon, then you clear it again, then you clear it again, and then you might clean it. And I had just cleaned it like 2 or 3 weeks earlier, and I hadn't been shooting it, but I wanted to clean it again. And I slid back the slide, and a round came out. And when that did, that kind of snapped me out of it. I knew there was a bullet still in the chamber. You know, I was kind of hoping that, you know, an accident, you know, they'd pay the insurance to my wife, and I could just make the pain stop. But I didn't have the guts to kill myself, you know. And then I had this event at work occur, you know. My ego is rebuilt, and I'm an instructor. I'm teaching other pilots how to fly at the airline, and I'm over in Italy, and it's not going well, this trip with this captain. He's near his retirement, and we're over in Milan, Italy, and we're coming out of Milan, and I just been arrogant as hell on this trip. And we're coming out of Milan, and he looks at me, and he says, Dave, sit down, shut up. I'm sick of you. You know, I'm thinking, all right, I'll show you. You know, I know better than you. And about 10 minutes later, we're flying up into the mountains, and I see this guy's making a mistake. But he's told me to sit down and shut up, so I fold my arms. You know, I'm not doing my job. I'm just watching this guy make this mistake, you know. And there was a crew of 3, and I'm pulling on the shoulder harness of the other guy that's flying with us, and I'm saying, hey, what's this? We shouldn't be doing this. And I tried to say something to the captain. He said, I told you to shut up, right? My ego had alienated the crew to the point where I see a mistake and I can't stop it. We almost flew into the side of the Alps with over 400 people on board the airplane. That got my attention, you know? And so now this guy, he's screwed up royally. I've screwed up royally. He's going to fly across the Atlantic. You know, we've overboosted all 4 engines to save the airplane. It's ugly. This is an ugly, ugly situation. And of course, I can't put my 2 cents in. He won't talk to me, you know? And I landed at Kennedy Airport. The obsession was back. Every exit, I had to ask God, don't let me pull off. I don't want to get drunk. I drove right past my house and went to my home group. And they loved me. It was the first time in my life I'm sitting in uniform, and I'm just sobbing in the meeting. They loved me. They didn't say a word. They rubbed my back, you know. And then it's back to what Carl taught me. You tell the truth. When they ask a question, you tell the truth. The union came to me and they basically told me to lie. They said, we learned something from Richard Nixon. I can't remember, works just fine. And I said, I'm not going to lie. If somebody asks me a direct question, I will tell the truth. If they ask me what time it is, I won't build them a clock, but I'm not going to lie. And we went through these hearings, and everybody else was lying, you know, and they figured out what really happened, you know, and they fired everybody except me. But at that time, I was part of management. I was an instructor. Management didn't want anything to do with me because this event had happened. The union doesn't want anything to do with me. I'm a pariah at work. And it was the one place I was getting good feelings. My wife was upset with me because I was a terrible husband at that point. And I'm getting all my strokes, all my ego stuff from work. And now nobody at work wants to deal with me. And I'm in crisis. Well, God's got a sense of humor. Because 4 days after that event happened, we get the phone call that nobody ever wants. I'm in the Air Force Reserve. I'm a reservist. It's like a flying club. You put on your uniform, you go, you make some money, and you retire, after 20 years. And they called me up and they said, hey, you're activated. You're going to the Gulf War. I'm thinking, oh. Now, up to that point, I'd been doing all the bills and everything, and I went to my wife and I said, here, I'll see you. I don't know when. I had 1 year orders, and we're going to the Gulf War. But Carl had taught me a ritual. Inside the word spiritual is the word ritual, and I followed certain rituals. Every time I would fly, in my helmet bag, I had a 12 and 12 and a big book, because that was what I was taught. I also had a grapevine. On the cover of the grapevine, it says, our meeting's in print, because I didn't know how long it was going to be till I'd catch another meeting. And I'm over in the Gulf War, and we're going into a facility, and they're firing Scuds, and the intelligence we have is under chemical attack. We think there's some chemicals in the Scuds. Some of the NATO allies are reporting there's chemicals, and I'm a reservist. I'm thinking, what is this? Once a year you put on your chem gear, you kind of joke around it. We're never going to use it. We're reservists. And now all of a sudden we got to put it on for real. And fear grabbed the whole crew. I think there was 13 guys on our crew, and everybody's in a panic. And the voices came back to me of the seeds that had been planted. And I reached in my helmet bag, and I'd never done this before up to that point. I pulled out the big book, and it fell open to the third step prayer. I turned my will and life back over to God at that point. For the first time, I think, in my life, I took the third step for real and said, God, if today's the day I die, today's the day I die, But I'm not stupid. I did put on the chem gear, And it was this terrible chem gear. It took like 45 minutes, and you had a chemical suit, and you had to put all this other stuff on and put your flight suit back over it. And, it turned out it was a false alarm, but it stuck with me. And so when I got back home, because I wasn't in the desert the whole time, we would fly periodically back and forth. We'd get back home, maybe once a month or so. I'd get back and be able to see my wife for a day, and then we'd go back out on another mission, going back eastbound. And I started calling up my guys, the guys that I had shortchanged. And I wrote another inventory, and I did some step work, and now came time for amends. And I started talking to these guys and said, hey, I want to give you the gift that was given to me, and if you'll give me the honor, let me take you through the big book. And so I started doing that, and they're like, well, I got a couple sponsees. That was awesome. Would you show me and them at the same time? And I want to see it again for another round. And the next, I'm doing 2 guys, and then 5 guys, and then 10 guys, and then leading workshops, and it's pretty cool stuff, and then all of a sudden I'm on the speaking circuit, and they're recording you, and, they're trying to put you up on a pedestal. Well, let me tell you, the speaking circuit in recovery is one of the most dangerous places you can be. It will kill you because your ego, I'm just a drunk. I'm one drink away from a drunk. But everybody's trying to put you up there as this guru, and it's a dangerous place to be. Now, I'd done a series of tapes, and I always use my full name, and I'm a pilot. And there was a guy in Chicago, Tommy, and he had listened. He was a tape junkie. Thank God for tapes. And he listened to the tape, and I don't know why, but I always put my name on the tape. I always tell people what my email address is. I still have an AOL email address. It's that old, because it's a 12-step ministry, because I still get emails from all over the world from those CDs. And this guy calls me one day, and once a year at my company, they publish a list, and there's like 12,500 pilots. And he'd gone down the list, and it's not by date of hire, it's just your name, and it's not alphabetical. It goes by the day you were hired, you get a number, and it goes by seniority number. And he went down until he found a D. Fredrickson. And I get this phone call, and he says, hey, are you the guy I'm listening to on tape? And I said, sure, I think so. We struck up a great friendship, and that's when I learned you could have these friendships, like I had with JR and Cody and Aaron, long-distance friendships. I'd never met the man, and he's listening to the tapes, and I'm having a wonderful life, and my wife and I are piecing our relationship back together, and life is taking on, she's no longer the AA widow where I'm just gone all the time, and when I come home, I don't want to spend any time with her. I'm still trying to get the marriage thing right and be a better husband to her, and we've outgrown our little house. And so she says to me, we need to move. And I'm like, I can't afford anything in North Jersey where we're living. I said, go to Pennsylvania, find a house in Pennsylvania. It's cheaper over there, cheaper taxes. And she's like, I'm not driving to Pennsylvania. And I said, well, try the internet. She didn't really know much about the internet. And she's like, why can't we move somewhere else your airline flies? And I said, like where? And she says, all these different locations. I said, nah, there's only one place I would consider, and that's Flower Mound, Texas, because I got a lot of pilot buddies down there. Big mistake, she's like, oh, Texas. So she goes on the internet and she finds the only builder that I know of that builds houses in Pennsylvania and Flower Mound, Texas. So I call a buddy of mine who I know who lives down there, Myers, and I said, hey, Myers, I need a realtor down there in your neck of the woods. And he says, oh, I got an old girlfriend who's a realtor. She'll help you out. So I called up Jan, and I said, Jan, I want to waste one of your days. I'm going to be honest with her. I said, I have no intention of moving to Texas. I just want you to get my wife exhausted. I have no intention of moving there. I want 14, 15 houses, a minimum per day, and I want her begging me to go back to the airport. So on Sunday, every time we kept going by these builder signs, I kept pointing at it going, my heart was speaking to me. God was talking to me, and I wasn't listening because I had Dave's plan. I didn't want to move to Texas. And so I said, Jan, Sunday, I said, stop the car. Take me to that builder. So we go to the builder, and I used to be a builder because I lost my job for a while, and I opened up Fly By Night Construction. Figured it was a great construction company, right? That's what I did. I flew at night, And so I'm walking through very arrogantly, and I'm saying, well, the crown molding's off here, and I'm pointing out all the things that are wrong with this brand new, beautiful house. And my wife comes to me and says, I love it. I want this house. So I'm like, well, if I'm going to have this house, we have to have this and this and this and this. And I'm throwing everything in. And long story short, and we're flying back to New Jersey, and we've got a contract on a house. And I'm thinking, what have I done? And I didn't have any money. I put $2,500 down with a contingency that I could back out of the deal and get my $2,500 back up until sheetrock stage, all right? So I'm back at home, and 4 days later, the phone rings, and I get a phone call from a guy at my company, and he says, hey, you Dave Fredrickson? I said, yeah. And he says, you the Dave Fredrickson I'm listening to on tape? And I said, probably. He says, I work for the company. He's in management. And he says, I want you to take over the drug and alcohol program for our company. And I said, oh, okay. He says, but there's a catch. I said, what's the catch? He says, you got to move to Texas. So I started laughing. I said, Mike, you're not going to believe this, but 4 days ago, I bought a house in Dallas, Texas. I had no idea why. He's like, you're kidding me. And I said, no. And so when God says you're going to Nineveh, you're going to Nineveh, So now I'm happy to move to Texas. So we pack up the house and we move down to Texas. And what a wonderful experience. I took over this drug and alcohol program, and all I did was use Applied Big Book, the principles that I learned in the rooms of recovery. And I did that job for about 7 years, I think. And when I got done doing that job, and the grace goes to God, we had a 97% recovery rate at the end of the first year. 95% recovery rate at the end of the fifth year, Historically, it's an above 90% recovery rate in that program, All the great grace, and it goes back to God. It's just what we learned in these rooms, the gift that was given to us by the original 100, working the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, Life is cool, But then I started taking credit. My ego started to rebuild for that deal. And so now look at the program I built, And as soon as I started taking the credit for it, overnight, I got fired from that job. They said, you're going back and fly airplanes for a living. We don't want you here anymore. I was like, wow, talk about slicing your ego, And God will give you those kind of gifts where he'll kind of slap you upside the head. I was killing myself. I was working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week doing that kind of work, But it was all about, it started growing up and being about ego, And now I've had the chance to spend time with my family, with my kids who are I have these two beautiful program babies. They're wonderful kids. They're ginormous. They're kind of like me, The 13 and 16-year-old. The 16-year-old is as tall as I am. The 13-year-old is, I think, 6'1½", The kid was 2 feet tall when he was born. He was 24 inches, But these kids, I see God speak through my family, And then in my story, it terrorized me. You walk home with a baby from the hospital and you're thinking, once again, I don't have a playbook for this. They're letting me out with this. Who's going to come show me how to take care of this little creature? You don't know. So where did I turn? I turned back to where I learned, to the recovery rooms, to this program. And I applied the 12 steps. And then I applied the 12 traditions. If the 12 traditions can keep us from killing each other, why can't they help me run a family? And so in my family, we use the 12 traditions, right? I was doing a workshop up at the Wilson House one day, and I kept talking about applying the 12 traditions, and it wasn't a new concept. Mary Pearl Thompson, she's got a wonderful series on the working the 12 traditions in relationships, and my wife and I were doing couples meetings and doing all kinds of great stuff, applying these traditions, and so we started applying the traditions with our kids. And so I'm doing this workshop, and I kept talking about the concepts, And so I wrote how to work the 12 concepts in a relationship, and we just substituted our marriage vows date into the concepts. And so if you talk to my kids, they know the 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts. 2 days before we came down here, I made a motion. We have a motion on the floor. I didn't get a second. I said, I want to go to Fuzzy's for lunch, And so we had this open debate. Well, it turns out Brenda had a nail appointment because she wanted to do her nails before we came down for this conference. So the minority position got a chance to voice her position. It swayed the group conscience. Instead of going to Fuzzy's for lunch, we went to Fuzzy's for dinner, and we ate leftovers for lunch so that she could make her appointment. That's applied traditions and concepts. We have a finance committee. It's not me. It's my wife. She does the finances, She has the right of decision. She can decide what she wants to do. She has the right of participation, right out of the concepts. We have all the tools we need right here in recovery that were given to us as a gift from our legacy. If I can impart anything to you, is don't lose it. Do not lose it. Do not miss the gift of the 12 steps in this book. If it's been a while since you've worked the 12 steps, by all means, go back and work the 12 steps. If you haven't worked with the newcomer in the last, I'll be generous, in the last 6 months, shame on you. There's plenty of newcomers around. You got to get out of your little clique and go find a newcomer and go shake the hand of the new person at the meeting and take your sponsees with you and say, hey, this is a newcomer. This is what we're going to do. I teach sponsorship to my guys. I teach them about how to do a 12-step call. I teach them about bringing garbage bags and rubber gloves and big books and baby wipes on a 12-step call and how to work with sauerkraut juice and honey, old-fashioned 12-step call, wet drunk calls. They don't happen all that time. But there's 12-step calls in this room. I bet you there's a 12-step call right here. I bet you there's an old-timer sitting in this room who hasn't worked the steps in a long time, and they're dying inside, but they have this image. They have to wear the mask. I've got X number of years. All it takes is a young person to come up to them and say, hey, would you show me how to fill in the blank? And in showing you how to do it, they'll go through the steps again themselves because you can't give away something you haven't got. And you're doing a 12-step call. You're saving their life. And they're in the rooms where the answer is, and they're dying on the vine, and it's a shame. We're losing our legacy, folks. The program is changing. All kinds of outside issues are getting involved. AA is becoming a dumping ground. There's this rivalry between AA and Al-Anon. I don't understand it. We're the same. It's the same 12 steps. We are kindred spirits. This is a family disease. I'm living proof of it. If you haven't had a barn-burning spiritual experience, if you don't have an intimate relationship with your God, where your best friend is your relationship with your higher power, that you go through every day with them by your side, guess what happens? God will give you a big chunk of life, will drop into your lap, and you'll jump into the foxhole, and you'll be thinking, okay, God, I need help here, and you won't know the voice to listen to because you haven't talked to God. You haven't had that relationship. When I jump in the foxhole today, I know the voice in an instant because he's my best friend. I talk to him every morning throughout the day. That's what this program is about, practicing these principles in all your affairs. And we're going to talk about, at another talk, about the principles. What are they? Obviously, there's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts. There's a whole bunch more principles, and we're losing it. Nobody knows. We need to grab this thing before it disappears. And thank God they wrote it down in a book. And if you read our history books, it says they put it in the book so the message wouldn't get garbled or distorted. All we need is right here, right now. We've got great sources of literature, but the torch has been passed. We just lost Charlie Parmley from Joe and Charlie workshops. Joe McQuaney died a long time ago, well, maybe 3 years ago. That's a long time. Charlie just passed. If you're in this room and you got double-digit sobriety, guess what? You are the old-timer. And before you know it, you'll wake up and you'll look around and you'll go, wow, Big Ears Danny is dead. Come on now, George is dead. Jim McCabe, what a wonderful man. He's the guy that I showed up at his group. He was this big old fat guy and he came wandering up to me and I knew his son, Joe. Joe was a friend of mine. He was a teenager like me. And Jim looked at me and he said, hey kid, I see you looking at the girls. I said, yeah. He goes, don't you look at the girls. You don't come anywhere near the girls. I said, what do you mean? He says, I'm old, I'm fat. He goes, I'll grab some of my boys and we will kick the tar out of you. We'll give you a blanket party. You stay away from the girls. He was protecting the women in Alcoholics Anonymous from the predators. I was a sexual predator when I was early in recovery. I was a walking disaster area. I was spreading my disease wherever I could spread it. that stuff is going on today. It's time for us to stand up and say, you want to do that someplace else. But this is a safe place where recovery is, where you find a barn-burning experience, you come to know God, and your life changes. If your life is miserable, if you're feeling sad, if you have agitation in your day, if you've had a lousy week this week where it's felt like somebody pissed in your Wheaties when you woke up, there's relief. It's in the book. Come do what we're doing. There's a lot of people in this room, and have the experience. My life is so great. It's fantastic. But there's one key. What I want doesn't matter. My life is none of my damn business. I took a third step, and I turned my will and my life over to God. So I get up every morning, I plug into that source of power and say, what do you want? You know, if you look at the dashboard on my car, right next to the speedometer, it says, what I want doesn't matter. If you look at the base of my computer screen at home, it says, what I want doesn't matter. Constant reminders to me that I'm not running this show. I carry God's vision into every area of my life. I work really hard. I am a mad dog alcoholic addict, right? I work the same way in my program because that's what it takes to offset the spiritual malady. I don't have physical craving anymore because I don't drink alcohol. By having a relationship with God, I got rid of the mental obsession. By definition, according to the book, that makes me, without those two pieces, I'm recovered from a hopeless state of mind and body. I still have the third piece of our addiction, the spirit malady, the restless, irritable, and discontent. And every day, God gives me a chance to get rid of that. He gives me another day sober. My debt to God gets one day bigger. So I get up the next day and I say, God, I got to make this world a better place because I'm in it and I'm sober. And I try to pay the debt off, and he gives me another day sober. And my debt gets one day bigger. Let's make this conference, the rest of this conference, the best thing that's ever happened to this hotel. I charge each and every member of this room to go out and make this world a better place because you're in it today and you're sober. You've been given the gift. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving me the chance to share and cry in front of you folks. I love you all. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this recording. If you are interested in other speaker tapes or CDs from AA or Al-Anon, please contact us at Sound Solutions, toll free 1-877-893-2777, or visit us on the web at soundsolutionsrecording.com. We are also available to cover your recording and sound system needs. Thank you for allowing us to be of service and carrying the message.